Well, hello. If you're listening, this is another new episode of NMPC Plus. Thank you so much for listening. This is also take 2 on the video. We said that we would try it out last week, and we did try it out, and it didn't work. So hopefully this time, this iteration and this episode of the podcast will actually have some video. For those of you who are listening, and also for those of you who are watching, my name is Josh. I'm the worship pastor here at New Mercy Palisades Church, little old church plant that could in Palisades Park, New Jersey. And I'm joined, as always, by Pastor Bobae. Hello, Pastor Bobae.
Hello.
And I am joined by Pastor Key at the end of the table. Hello, Pastor Key.
Hello, hello.
How you guys doing today? How do you feel? This is also the first time that we set up the tables like this. I figured if we're going to do it, let's do it.
Do it right.
You know what I mean? I wonder,
why not?
Yeah. So, this is just our little way of trying to, I don't know. I just thought it'd be cool to do it like this.
I'm a little thrown off.
Yeah. You're thrown off?
Yeah, because Bobae's always on your left.
That's true.
Usually, and that's always kind of the rhythm.
That's true.
Of your introduction.
Yeah, well, we're always growing here, okay? We're moving fast. We're a speedboat. We're not a cruise ship. Sometimes we make lefts. Sometimes we make right. Sometimes people will see how weird I am in my actions, and other times people will hear them too on the podcast. I don't know what I'm saying. In any case.
Anyway.
So that's going to be our clip on Instagram.
Yes. Well, hopefully we'll have some better clips. Before we get into it, I wanted to ask, because it's something I think even last week it was kind of in the news, but we never really got a chance to speak about it. Mm-hmm. But have you two heard anything at all about the Asbury Revival that's been going on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Somebody I know went there, actually.
Yeah, that's right. You had mentioned that last week for a brief second. For those of you who are unfamiliar, there's this. What I understand, the best I could try to understand is there's a small like Bible college, Christian school, a lot like the one that I went to. I went to Nyack College, but this particular school in Kentucky is called Asbury University. And basically what happened is, to the best of my understanding, they had a chapel service one day.
Yeah.
And then towards the end of the chapel service, there was kind of like a movement or some kind of a thing that started happening in which people just hung around and they hung around and they hung around. And this revival service, it just ended up lasting days and days on end.
Yeah.
I don't know what the last count was, but basically after a few days, even throughout the weekend, I believe it was, they finally just said that Monday would be the last day of this gathering of what was happening at this small little school in Kentucky, mostly because of logistical problems.
Yeah.
Like, people were flocking to Asbury University, and it caused all of these different problems in and throughout the town of I think it's Wilmore, Kentucky that it was. And so, I don't know if you guys have heard about it at all. I just kind of want to get your takes on the situation, what you've heard about, or how you feel about it all.
Yeah.
Anything at all?
It was pretty cool, I thought.
Yeah. When did you first hear about it?
Man, it was on social media, and I think the first person I heard, like, here and there. I didn't really pay attention initially, but then Rob Reamer wrote a post on Facebook about it. He's a professor at Alliance Seminary.
Yep.
And I was like, okay, well, this is interesting, and I want to reserve judgment. Mm-hmm. Like, people are going back and forth. Is it like a real revival? Is it a real awakening? And this and that. But I don't know. I think people who were there were being genuine. I think they genuinely experienced something. I do like so a lot of people were commenting on it. I do like what some people said. It's ultimately the fruit of the revival that determines whether it was legitimate or not. And I think those are wise words. But the only other thought I had was, man, I'm curious if the administration, and, I know it was probably hard for them, trying to figure out the logistics and stuff and, fire code and this and that. But a part of me is wondering if they went the other way and they're like, instead of shutting it down, what can we do? What resources do we need to make it allow it to keep going?
Right.
And I'm so curious how that could have ended, but it ended the way it did. And, I'm sure God's sovereign over all of that. But genuinely, I'm reserving judgment. I don't really know. It does seem like it was a legitimate experience for everybody who went. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. What about you, Pastor Bobae? Have you heard anything about it at all?
From the person that went, I didn't hear it directly, but what that person said was that it was like a very sweet and pure revival, like feeling there, and it's not like super like dramatic or explosive, but that it was like very sweet. I think it's cool. Like, you don't see a lot of that, and especially from like, the newer generation leading it, because it was all like student led. I think that's really powerful, and I think a lot of people are, curious, or like maybe some people are skeptical, like, what is this about, whatever. But I feel like, like the fruit is going to be what is going to show us that this is a move of God. But I think also just the testimonies that are flowing out of that, I think is evidence enough for me anyway, to say that God is really on the move to something. And I feel like, isn't it like, aren't they like trying to relocate it or something?
Yeah, that's what I heard. Because if it's going to happen sort of at the same clip or at the same pace with the same amount of people, then they definitely need to relocate it just because of logistics. Like a lot of what I heard, it's just a logistics problem right now.
So it's not technically like ending. They're trying to like see where they can go. Like today I saw a clip and people are still there, like going there, trying to get a piece of it, like trying to get a taste of it. And something like there are other universities that kind of caught the fire and are having their own little pockets of revival. And obviously one of the fruit is that it spreads. It's not just located to Asbury University, but that it spreads. So, I mean, we'll see. I'm excited to see what like is birthed out of this movement. Hopefully, it'll come this way too. Why not, right? Why not us, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So, I actually like this makes me more hopeful and more expectant for something to happen in our day and age, So
when I was reading a little bit about it, and when I had first heard about it, man, I had a bunch of thoughts on it as well. For me, the kind of beginning half of my ministry, I was with the ministry in the local area, and a lot of what we were trying to do was, our slogan, our tagline was just try to bring revival to this region. Whatever that looks like. And we sort of banged on that drum for years and years and years, And so when I heard about what was going on, there was a part of me that was like, there? Why not here, Lord? You know what I mean? There's a part of my heart, and I'm just being super honest right now. Like, there was a part of my heart that got a little bit jealous about what was happening, And this isn't one of those like holy jealousies that I had either. If I'm being really honest, it was kind of like oh man, that's really cool, but why not here, and why not in this region? Why not for the ones that have been banging that drum around here for generations? And that's not just me, but I mean people that have come before me and people that are going to come after me. Like, why not here? And as I continue to think through it, there's also the strange and icky thing of like, because I don't know how else to like get information on it than to like go on news sites or go to YouTube and all that stuff. And almost immediately after I put in like revival, like Asbury Revival, there were like YouTube videos right next to the chapel service video of like, the thumbnail of like the guy or the girl that's like sitting there like, I went to Asbury Revival.
Oh, yeah.
Here's what I saw. And I don't know. I don't know if this is me continuing to resist the moment that we find ourselves in, but I don't know. Is that just human nature of like people need to go and see and then report on it and then be like, this is real, this is not, like, is that just a product of the fact that we live in this time in which everything needs to be broadcast and everything needs to be like put out there on YouTube and I know that sounds a little bit even hypocritical, even as we sit around this table and try to do that same thing. You know what I mean? But
right.
That's true.
Yeah, I don't know. I struggle not with whether or not it's good. I think I'm kind of in the same place as you guys. Just let the fruit of the ministry, fruit of whatever happened in this moment, let that kind of be the determining factor of whether or not it was good or whether or not it was bad. But it's just one of those things where like when God does something, he reveals kind of what's in your heart. And he reveals what's in your heart in so many different ways, the good and the bad, you know what I mean? So,
yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. And I like how you talked about it. One thought that kind of hit me was a lot of the people there, it seemed like, quote unquote, they called them the Gen Z.
Yeah.
I saw some posts like, oh, we have hope in Gen Z.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then I listened to the songs they were singing. I'm like, those are not Gen Z songs. Those are really old songs.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I guess there's those, those songs are still being passed on.
For sure.
So that was interesting.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. I haven't given up on this or the next generation at all, but there's also a little bit of a grieving that happens, and I'm still kind of in that place of grieving the idea that that's not necessarily the kind of work or the kind of ministry that I do anymore. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I don't know. I just thought it was interesting as a podcast. As just a group of pastors that kind of get around the table and talk about these kinds of things. I just thought it was interesting to kind of think about that. And I think the other question that I had was the idea of, that is in Kentucky, right? That is kind of over there. And whether right or wrong, I think my mind sort of immediately goes to, couldn't that happen here?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I guess I just want to ask you guys, if we think about it a little bit, and if we're being honest with ourselves, have you given any thought to like, could something like that even happen here? Mm-hmm. Could understanding the sort of culture of spirituality and the culture that kind of we are here in the Northeast, could something like that happen here in this region? And I would also qualify it by saying we get that God can do anything. Like, we totally understand that. I'm saying, like, this is more so about like the human heart and the human ability to want a move of God so deeply and desperately that it actually tips the needle so much that a wave like that happens. I don't know. Is something like that even possible here in this region?
I have to hope. But when I immediately, my mind went to a couple Bible locations. One was where Jesus says he went to this town, and the Bible says he was not able to do as much because of the lack of faith.
Yeah.
So that makes me like, oh, well, Northeast is not very conducive to that.
Yeah.
But then, you remember the story of Jonah and Nineveh, which is completely like anti-God. Mm-hmm. And Jonah preached a message of repentance, and there was all-out repentance and revival there despite their condition, And so when I look at those two sides of the spectrum, I'm just like, well, I think we fall somewhere in between. I think it's possible. Mm-hmm. But what will bring about that kind of revival is a question. What method will God use? But from the human side, I don't know, man. It's tough. I've actually talked to a lot of pastors from different regions. They're like, I don't know how you guys do ministry in the Northeast. That's where ministers go to die. I'm like, what?
Jeez, my God. Grow some skin.
Yeah.
I'm not kidding.
But yeah, like you said, God can do it, but given the realities of the Northeast, I think it's going to take a special move, personally.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a reason why it wasn't at a major city.
Interesting.
I think, like, and I'm just talking here, thinking out loud.
Go ahead and talk then.
Yeah. I think I do believe that revival is possible in this area. Partly because, like, mainly because I know God can do anything, but also I think there are pockets of people that are really going from a one-dimensional religious life to seeing God's power move in different ways, not just one but many ways, and people are coming more awake to the reality of the spiritual, which I think is very necessary. So I do believe that it can happen here, but I think maybe this is just my hypothesis.
Go ahead.
But maybe the reason why it wasn't at a major city was possibly like because of the spiritual warfare that happens. Because think about it. Let's say revival broke out in New York City. The kind of influence it could have globally, I think, is beyond anything we can imagine. You know? And because of that, I think probably the enemy is working double time, triple time here to keep us under a lull. And so, not to say that God can't break through that lull, but I think there requires something of us believers, whether it's in the type of faith we have or the way we're praying for revival to come to this area, that we need to be unified on in order to see that kind of revival come.
Yeah.
And I think there is something to how this Asbury University revival, you know, how that people are describing it as sweet and pure. I think that pure piece is like really important. When receiving the revival. And yeah, so I do believe that it could happen here. Now, will it happen the same as Asbury? Probably not. Or maybe it will, you know? But I think my hope personally, when I was, you know, because there were people live streaming it for like 24/7, right?
Yeah.
And I'm watching it, and as I'm watching, even like I literally watch like 2 minutes at a time, just to see like how it's going, you know. And every time I would tune in, there's this hope that arises in my heart, and I'm hoping that when it happens, wherever I may be, whether it's here or, you know, in New York City or wherever that's near here, like I hope I have eyes to see that this is a revival. I think not everybody's going to be on the same page as us. Not everybody's going to recognize this as a revival, even Asbury, right? Like people probably, I don't know what people are saying on social media or anything, but like people might be critics of it, you know, and they might miss what God is actually doing. And I don't want that.
Yeah.
So the hope for me and for all of us, I think, is that we would have eyes to see and know and recognize that this is a move of God.
Yeah. Yeah. That's an interesting point that you bring up, the idea of could it have happened in a major city? You know, the area that we minister to, I mean, we minister to a very smaller area than just like the larger Northeast and like Northeast corridor, right? We're in New Jersey and we're in a very specific town. Our region that we serve is maybe a little bit smaller, right? But it's still quite a large bit of region that we try to minister to. And yet, even still beyond that, like the Northeast Corridor, New York City, New Jersey, the tri-state area, all of it kind of seems so big that like can one church, can one body, can one entity really even touch an entire region like that? So it's funny that you say that could it have happened in a big city. I don't know if you guys have heard this before, but there was a thing. Someone said this to me years ago, but I went to I went to a Hillsong concert. This was before they set up camp, really, in New York and New Jersey. And Hillsong just sort of sent a team, and they were touring, and they were going everywhere. And I went to one of the, I guess, concerts or worship nights or whatever you want to call it. And I went there, and I think it was Joel Houston who was kind of saying some stuff. And he was saying how for years people were saying, don't go to the Northeast. Like, don't go to New York City. Don't go there because it's not going to be the way that you think it's going to be, right?
Yeah.
And then after that, I just thought that was interesting, but I kind of put that away. And then the people that I was with that night, particularly my one friend, he was saying how he had heard that before, that he had heard that these Christian artists, especially in the 90s and the early 2000s, in which kind of CCM was bigger than it has ever been.
Yeah.
And there were plenty of touring artists and musicians, and they would go to all these places. But one of the few places that they would avoid in America was the Northeast, specifically New York City, because it was just so dead and empty, and everybody was just doing their own thing, and nobody really cared about all these things. And so it's funny that you mentioned that, Bobae, just because I sometimes go back to that place, right? And I heard that years ago. I want to say like upwards of 10, 12 years ago, I heard that. And you know, Hillsong coming to New York City marked like a huge shift and a huge kind of change in the region. But then again, I come back to this is 2023. And are we back there? Have we progressed? Have we progressed as far as we wanted to as a region? And this is a larger conversation than the three of us can sort of hash out right now. But I don't know. I just every once in a while, my mind kind of goes there. And I think the Asbury Revival itself was sort of, it just got me thinking again.
Yeah.
Thinking about our region.
Yeah.
Thinking about maybe a little bit more than just our church. I mean, this podcast exists because we wanted to speak to our people, right? That still remains true even to this day. But every once in a while, I am caused and I am led to think about more than just our church, and I think about this region, you know? And so, I don't know. I don't know if something like that could happen right now. Not because God doesn't want it, but I don't know how many of the people do.
Yeah. I mean, here's what I'll say. I think, just to modify what I said a little bit, knowing the people that I know and knowing how God is moving their lives, I do think revival is possible, you know. And we've seen, personally, I've seen a move of God happen within our community, right? And so, I don't know, when I think about my people, our people, when we think about some of the other people I know in this region, I definitely think it's possible. There really is strong faith and hunger there. Another thing I will say is, one of the things they said to Tim Keller when he launched Redeemer back in the early 90s was that he was going to fail.
Yeah.
You don't plant a church in New York City.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
But he went and he did it. And one of the things that he's gifted at is just contextualizing and adapting his preaching for the people of this area, right? And once you can kind of needle your way through some of those issues that are specific, I would say, or, I mean, everybody struggles with these things, but there's something very specific about this particular region. They struggle with certain ideas and things like that. And he's able to kind of work his way through them. And a lot of people came to God because of that, you know? And I feel like part of it is going to be us unpacking our region and knowing and actually unpacking what the culture is because we love them that much. And I feel like if more and more people can do that and more people come to God, I definitely think it's possible. So, yeah. Because you can't take, some strategy that happens in Kentucky and bring it over here and it's just going to click.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Sure.
Like, and so for people who say, I'm going to take Hillsongs and we're to New York and it's going to die because this isn't Australia.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so I don't know. There's a lot there. I feel like we can talk a lot about these things, contextualization and things like that. But I think it's possible.
Yeah. It's possible. Is it possible? Sure, it's possible. Will it look like what it did in Kentucky? Maybe not. And maybe that's what we're saying, right?
Maybe better. maybe
better. I don't know. Is one move of God better than another move of God?
There you go. You got me.
No, but let me try to put some kind of a nice little wrapping paper on this idea. As much as maybe it grinds my gears a little bit, the people that go to Asbury in a sort of voyeuristic sense.
Yeah.
Right? As much as that kind of grinds my gears, I'm sure that there are also people that are going to Asbury and that have gone and come back from that little place in Kentucky, and they didn't go because of any voyeuristic reason, but they went because they were hungry.
Yeah.
And they wanted something. They wanted something that maybe they weren't getting or they couldn't give to themselves, and they just decided to go out there and to see what's happening. And to that degree, I think God honors desperation, and I think God honors hunger. And so to those people that are truly hungry, maybe that's what it takes, right? Like maybe it's the hungry that are going to eat the most, and they're going to enjoy it the most too, right? So yeah, I mean, hopefully, if you just heard about the Asbury Revival, from this little conversation, hopefully that causes you to maybe look into it, but then also that you would look into it with new and hopeful eyes rather than cynical and less than helpful ones, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, if I could say something to that as well, I have a very strong aversion to spectacle and people flocking to spectacle.
Yeah.
Sometimes when I see people going to these massive Christian concerts, they're, going crazy. I'm just like, well, let's see what happens a week from now.
Sure.
What are you going to be like when somebody, cuts you off on the road or whatever, right? So that's kind of my instinct. But when I look in the New Testament, I realize Jesus drew crowds. There was a lot of spectacle there. And clearly, like you said, there are a lot of people who were very hungry and desperate for God who flocked to him. So in that way, it kind of, I found myself chastened. Don't judge on it simply because of the way it looks. There are always going to be people who exploit it, but then there's other people who really, and there's a lot of them who really want God, and that's why they go.
Yeah,
and I think that's okay.
Yeah. Get it however you can get it, I guess.
Why not?
Yeah. Let's take a break, just because what we're gonna do next is like, so different from what we're talking about now. So let's take just a small break, and then we'll get back into it with the sermon conversation. So don't go anywhere if you're watching. Don't go anywhere if you're listening. And we're back. Thank you for waiting the 10 seconds. We appreciate you coming back. We are in the middle of, or actually this past Sunday, we got to the end of the latest little series. Pastor Key gave the message. As we do, we're just trying to unpack it, and we're trying to talk a little bit about kind of what happened on Sunday and maybe expand on it and kind of take that idea a little bit deeper. Also, too, Pastor Key, we had our staff meeting yesterday, as we always do on Tuesdays. And you had said something very interesting, and I want to get into that. But for right now, just for the sake of this conversation and to build a little bit of context about what's going on, Pastor Key, I'm going to give it over to you. And if you could just help us understand where we were, what your message was about, kind of your overall heart, and where you wanted to steer it, and then we'll sort of take it from there.
Yeah. So this was the last sermon in Walking with the Spirit series, and so if in the first sermon we talked about experiencing God, why that's important, why that's a product of our faith. The second sermon we talked about faith, right? And I encourage people to recognize faith as something that's very rational and that's very reasoned, and using the reasoning as a resource for us to take that bolder step of faith. Sometimes people can't take that bold step of faith because they're like, oh, it's not rational. There's no reasoning behind it. But when you see that there is, like, oh, I could take this step of faith, and it's very sound, you know. And so I talked about that in the second one. And the third one, I talked about obedience.
Yeah, and that was this past Sunday.
Yeah,
Yep.
and basically the main theme was, or the main idea was, you only really get to know something after you do it.
Mm.
And in the Christian life, that looks like obedience, right? And I talked about how when you do obey, these things unfold in your life. You discover things about God that you didn't know before, because as you're doing it, you see deeper truths. Just like, you know, you play any sport. The more you play it, the deeper you see the strategy and the truths behind it. And I think I used pizza, the making of pizza, to, you know, illustrate that, and how when I started making pizza, I was like, oh my God, I know so much more about pizza, so many things I didn't even see before.
Right.
And that was very helpful to me.
Yeah.
You know? And so the Christian life is very similar. And it's interesting because all the big writers, all the Christian spirituality people, they all would say the same thing about obedience.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Obedience is the key that unlocks every door, is what C.S. Lewis said, right? And so the fact that everybody says it, I think there's something to it. And so basically the way it works is, as we take these steps of faith and obey God, as we're walking with the Spirit, we will experience deeper intimacy, deeper relationship, and things like that.
Yeah.
With God.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
There was one part of the message, and I actually, because you upload your manuscript, which is not something that I was very used to before I started serving here, but you uploaded your manuscript, and I got to kind of re-listen to your sermon as I was sort of reading through your manuscript. Yeah. Number one, as a fellow preacher, I think it's always nice to see, and it's always interesting to see what your actual I just did it, like your ums and your ahs and your little breaks, and how that might fit in, and how that might actually kind of go into your manuscript. Sometimes I get so into sermon prepping that I'll input some of those things in, like those little moves.
Yeah.
That I'll actually put them in. Anyway, that's neither here or there. I just kind of said that. But there was one part of the message. I'm gonna kind of recant it for us, and then I kind of wanted to take that idea a little bit deeper. You said this: if you actually do the will of God, this is right around the 25-26 minute mark. You say something to the effect of, if you actually do the will of God, you will have these moments of illumination and discovery that you simply cannot access any other way. And then you shared a quote by Philip Yancey, which says, I do not get to know God, then do his will. I get to know him by doing his will. Yeah. I think that is such a lovely and wonderful, grounding yet accessible thing and truth for us all to sort of meditate and sit on for a while. But here's the thing. A lot of us, many of us, will sit and meditate and think about and process something like that, and then we won't actually ever get around to doing his will.
Yeah, that's right.
Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Can you, and I'd love for the both of you to kind of speak into this however you can, but can you speak into the idea of, as a pastor, as a preacher, I'm trying to convince you of something. A lot of preaching is just, I'm trying to convince you of something. Mm-hmm. In this sermon, Pastor Key, the idea is you're trying to convince us to be obedient in our relationship with the Lord so that we would actually do the will of God. Thereby we get to know him more, right? And that's basically what this moment, what this excerpt is about. But can you speak into that? Because between my trying to get to convince you of something and your actually listening, taking up the mantle, and then doing something about it, there's often a disconnect, right? Yeah. So help me understand what that disconnect is. Help me understand, like, why this is nice. I do not get to know God, then do his will. I get to know him by doing his will. But why don't we do his will as much as we should? Like, how come we don't, you know?
Yeah, that's the mystery, right? You okay, Bobae?
Yeah.
You seem a little tired.
No, I'm fine. I'm thinking.
Yeah.
My brain is going.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's the perennial question,
Yeah.
right? Jesus telling people to do things, why they didn't do it.
Yeah.
And I can only speak from personal experience.
Sure.
For me, it really boils down to just, here's what I'll say. What's interesting is, as you do God's will, it's very not glamorous.
Yeah.
That's what people have to realize, is the doing of God's will is actually, believe it or not, very laborious, very burdensome, very hard. But as you're doing it, a concrete example would be, in the book of Acts, in the beginning, it says, go spread the gospel, make disciples from Jerusalem and on and outward, right? And I take that very seriously, so you go on missions, right? As I've gone on missions, man, I'm getting like canker sores in my mouth. I'm tired out of my mind.
Sure.
This and that. The team is like falling apart. People are getting upset at one another. I'm like, what is this? Right? This is not the fruit of. This is not what I expected. But in those times that I've struggled in that obedience, God would pop up and do something amazing. And then I was like, oh, okay, I see. This would not have happened if we had not taken the step to obey through the hard grind of this initial thing. And so, I don't know. I really don't know what will get people's butts off their chairs to do something. But just keep telling these stories, and maybe one day somebody will be like, you know what? I'm going to try it.
Yeah.
I think that's really that's the only thing I've seen in my life. Somebody be like, hey, Pastor, I was convicted by what you said. I'm going to go on missions. And then they go on missions. They're like, oh my God, this thing happened. And then it becomes a reinforcing cycle at that point, right? And so I feel like some people, they just need to take one step somewhere. And then not just once, but just keep going into that thing and then experience God there. And then I feel like that'll be a reinforcing cycle. I don't know. That's really, that's the biggest thing that pastors struggle with. Like, how do we get people to do stuff?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
listen, I recognize that I'm not asking the easiest of questions, right? but
this is the real stuff.
Yeah,
you know
this
what
is
I
the
mean?
job. This is the job of trying to get people to actually hear what we're saying and then do it, right? But I don't know. Bobae, I need your help. I need you to speak into that disconnect between me saying to somebody, just obey. And we're going to get into this in a little bit, but the idea of like obedience leads to a more unique life. That was one of the points that you were making, Pastor Key, that eventually like you'll know that obedience to the Lord is not constricting. It's actually opening up more places in your life for you to become the unique individual that you are, but there's still that disconnect. I mean, tell me a little bit about how you wrestle with that disconnect as a pastor, as someone who's also trying to convince people to do that which you see as good. But
I think there's like two things I think about. The first thing is I think people are afraid of what they need to follow God in.
I see.
And then I think the second one is they don't know what to do. And I think those two things are probably the majority of the reason why people don't do anything. Now, if I can add like a third one, I think it's just straight up laziness.
Yeah.
Like just being really honest, right?
Comfort.
Like there's like not enough. I have plenty of conversations where people are like, I want to do this. I want to follow Jesus. I wanna. And then they don't.
Yeah.
So then do you really want it, or are you just lazy?
Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
I think contributing to the lazy, I think lazy is joined with comfort. Because a conversation came up with somebody who I think is actually a very good Christian, but they were blunt to me. They said, I have a good amount of money. I have a nice house. I find myself not wanting to put that at risk.
Sure.
And I feel like that's probably a pervasive thing in this region.
Sure.
Right. And that speaks to what you're talking about, Pastor Bobae. I think that is it's a lock on people from taking that step.
Yeah. And you know what? I said this before and I say it again. I really don't think like God wants to push us to the edge of breaking in that way.
Yeah.
At least not everybody.
Okay. Yeah. I was just about
Yeah,
to
at
push
least
back.
not everybody.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
And I think the people that God does push, it's because they've been pushed in different ways before. God doesn't just push somebody over the cliff.
No,
You
that's
know?
right. I think you're right. I think a lot of people have this image of God that he's going to make them do the hardest possible thing if they open their lives up to God.
It's because that's the thing that they're the most afraid of losing.
Yeah.
And like, if God immediately made me give up food, I would not obey. But he doesn't ask that of me. That's a very silly example, but it's a very true example.
I have a story about that. by
Like
the
the
way, but go
Lord
ahead.
knows fasting, he's going to save that for something that really counts. But he's going to make me fast the other things to prep me for the one thing that really counts. I think, if at least in my relationship with the Lord, that's always been the case. He preps me to do the big thing.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah.
Right? But then, just going back to what I was saying, I think if we can't obey even in the very basic things about spending time with God, reading his word, then that fear that I was talking about will always take over our obedience, because you don't know what God is asking of you. And you're making all this stuff up in your brain about the possibilities of what God is going to take away from you, because you're absolutely afraid of losing that thing that you're afraid of losing.
Wow.
And I think, number one, the Lord, he's a gentleman. He's a jealous God, but he's also very gentle. And he's a righteous person. And he knows literally everything about us. We have to trust in that. When he says, I want you to do this. This is, spend time with me. You know what I mean? Like, even in the basic. Because unless you do that, you won't know. And then people ask the questions, I don't know what God wants me to do. Well, did you try this? Did you try reading, spending time, praying? Like, you tried that? And then maybe it'll get clearer.
Yeah. And when people say that they don't know what God wants them to do, I think they're almost looking for something very like specific, like he wants me to do this thing.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, the Bible is very clear about what God wants you to do.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Do any of that.
Yeah.
Start with one of those little things.
Yeah, for sure.
And their God, I think, will open up things.
If you look in the Bible, generally speaking, all the people that God commanded to do something extravagant, they were already counted as righteous before the Lord.
Yeah.
Like, we have to think about that.
Yeah.
There's so much value in that line.
Yeah.
They were already doing the stuff before God asked them to do anything.
And to reinforce your point, you see the disciples' lives, right? I mean, they're bumbling, falling all over themselves for like 3 years, but slowly God was making them. And what they end up accomplishing for the kingdom, what they were at the beginning, they would not have been able to do that. They would not have been able to give up those sacrifices. They would not have been able to suffer the way they did. But Jesus walked them through, exposed the idols, kind of worked on them, showed them love, and gave them faith and power and all that stuff. But then I do struggle with, there is that one instance where he points out that one idol to the rich young ruler, right? He said, you have done all these things, but this thing you lack.
Absolutely.
give up all your money, sell all your possessions. And then this is one of the saddest moments in the Gospels, where the rich young ruler walks away sad because he couldn't do it. Mm-hmm. And Jesus, the text says, looked at him and loved him. And I'm like, what is going on there? You know what I mean? But I don't want to take that particular story as indicative of, I don't want to make it bigger than what it is. And also, I think there's a lot more going on there than meets the eye. And also, we don't know the end of that story, believe it or not. You know what I mean? Maybe Jesus, because I think there's a lot of times when Christians are like, I can't do it. And then 10 years later, they have to do it, you know? And so maybe that rich young ruler failed there. Jesus' love continued with him. After the resurrection, something happened, changed his heart. And so, again, but that story sticks out to me. Yeah. And I'm sure it sticks out in everybody's mind.
Yeah, so, for sure. Yeah. It's funny that you guys make those particular points, Bobae, about, you know, just like the quick example of like if God told you to give up food, you wouldn't be able to do it. And Pastor Key, for you, you were just talking about the idea of like the rich young ruler and maybe hinting at the idea of progression and like, and how, who knows, maybe down the line there could have been something all we know is that one instance of his life, right? Yeah.
And sorry, and where you see that is actually, where you see somebody progressing is actually Nicodemus.
Yes.
Right, you preached the
I know
first
the story
sermon.
well.
You know the whole
I know the story
right?
very
and
well.
And then by the end, he's coming and he's with Joseph Arimathea, right? And then like he was still following Jesus, you know, and that's so powerful to me.
And the cover of night with the threat of persecution, Nicodemus and Joseph are the two people that are named that actually honor the Lord and give him a place of burial.
Yeah, and talk about putting your reputation and neck on the line.
Yep.
You know, that was what he was afraid of.
Yep.
You know, but
that happened in John 19. It didn't happen in John 3 when we first saw him.
Exactly.
Right.
But that gives us hope.
Exactly.
That there's this progression.
Exactly.
You know.
It's funny because I said I had a few stories, and hopefully this is actually encouraging rather than just me sharing how I flounder. I'm a big guy, you know. I'm a big guy. I have a very interesting relationship with food. I always have my entire life. I have two older brothers, and they're my size. They're greater than or equal to me. Okay, so just both in size and stature. We've all. The Lim men have all just sort of grown up in America with these huge statures. I have a very interesting relationship with food. I always have. I've always been heavy, always been like 99th percentile growing up in terms of weight and all that stuff. And so by the time I get to, adolescence, young adulthood, I just always have this thing. It messes with my self-esteem. It messes with my body image. It messes with my ability to even think of myself in more positive ways. Anyway, I have this interesting relationship with food, and I always have. I'm reminded of two seasons of my life, and this is like pretty early on in my ministry career. I was still, within the first 3 or 4 years, maybe both of these kind of situations occurred. But one season, speaking of Lent, actually, today is the day that we record this is the start of Lent, Ash Wednesday.
That's right.
So it's funny that this is coming back around.
What are you giving up, buddy? No.
Well, back then, I don't know how this came, okay? Bobae, I don't know how this came, okay? But at the beginning, or in the couple days or weeks leading up to Lent, I got really scared because I felt like God was saying, I want you to do like a I don't know what to call it now, but it's like a liquid fast, like no solid foods.
Nope, just juice.
Yeah, for all of Lent. Okay.
Sheesh.
And I got really scared. I was like, oh God, I don't know. I was like, no, I don't want to do it. And then, Ash Wednesday, the start of Lent, was getting closer and closer. And finally, I don't know what came over me, but I just decided I'm going to do it.
Oh, wow.
And I tried. And I wasn't very successful, but I tried. And actually, for the first 3 weeks of Lent, I want to say 20, 21 days, I was actually doing okay.
Oh, nice.
I take my Sabbath breaks, so it's like 6 days, and I get to sort of, with wisdom, just sort of take a break and then go back to it Monday through Saturday. So I take my Sabbath breaks, but for about 3 weeks, I was actually doing pretty good. And then there was in the middle of Lent, I had to go to a wedding, and it was a very dear friend of mine at the time, and I had already made up in my mind before that, because it's a celebration, because it's a very important friend to me. I just felt like it was okay to sort of break it. It was like on a Friday or Saturday, right? It wasn't a Sabbath break, and so in the middle of Lent, I went to this wedding, and I partook. I ate and I drank and I had a good time, and then I went home. And then the next day, I wake up and I'm like, man, I'm hungry. I just got to have my fill last night, man. I'm hungry. I'm hungrier than I've been than the first couple days, or even like up till now. After these many, I'm hungry, and so I was just like, wow, what's one more day? And so
I see.
I ate again, right? I broke my fast. And it, just to speed to the end, it happened over and over again until by like day 30 of Lent, I just said, I can't do it anymore, God. I'm such a sinner. I can't even do that which you've led me to do. And I was really struggling. I was really struggling with like my ability to like reason with God, and just whether or not I was right with God, I was right before God. Like I had a really hard time in that season. And these many years later, I look back on that season, and I think it was important. Number one, I think it was important for the Lord to show me that I'm not as strong as I think I am. Just because I set my mind to do something, it's not always going to work out the way that I think it is, especially when I do it on my own strength and on my power. Number two, I think the really big lesson for me, as I think about that season, is I think God was just showing me that, like, yeah, I knew you weren't strong enough. I knew you couldn't do it, but I still called you anyway. Right? So it was my obedience in that season. It had less to do with whether or not I could do it, and then everything to do with whether or not I would actually just obey.
Yeah.
Did it work out in the end? I don't know. But at the very least, what I knew was that I just decided that I would obey. Right? Okay, that's that season. I want to say maybe a year or two later, I felt like he was kind of coming back around. I don't think this was Lent, but I think the Lord, he was just highlighting 40 days. I want you to, so you see it. So it was kind of like almost like a redemption of Lent, that one season. So a couple years later, I felt like God was saying, okay, I want you to fast. And again, this wasn't even Lent. This was like during the summer, June and July. I just felt like God was saying red meat. I want you to fast red meat. And I think because I still had the failure of the first Lent fresh in my mind, I don't know. I prepared better. I prepared my heart better, but I also prepared my heart better in the way of, if I don't do well, I will already have the lesson that I had in the first Lent.
Yeah.
Which is, well, yeah, it's not by my own power. It's by the Lord's help. And I still just put my trust in the Lord anyway. I want to say through that season, God really brought me through. And for those that are watching, those that are listening, you're thinking red meat, that's not a big thing. Well, to me, it's a huge thing.
That's right.
And the consequences of giving something so simple as red meat, it just caused me to be more cognizant about what I'm putting in my body. It caused me like, I could go to fast food restaurants and get chicken sandwiches, but because the temptation was so close, I would avoid fast food altogether. Like I ended up eating better. I ended up doing all these things a little bit better because going back to that place of just being obedient, but also having the effect or the freshness of that last Lent still there. And so it's this idea of progression. It's this idea of giving up that which you couldn't in the beginning, but doing it again. It's the idea of God is not going to call you to do or to give up things that you can't handle. I don't know, maybe he will, but something in there, like if you're attentive and if you're attuned, even that, like, he'll teach you something or he'll show you something, or at the very least, he'll show you that he's still good, even when you are not faithful. Right? And so I don't know. I just think it's very interesting because we're talking about obedience again for those that are listening. We're talking about obedience and the effect of obedience in our lives, right? And the fact that 3 passages are talking about this idea that obedience opens up our lives in more ways than just, oh, I'm good because I was obedient.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I love your story because when you made the decision, I'm going to try to obey, right? In that struggle to obey, and even the failure, you learn things about God, you learn things about yourself, you learn grace, you know, and you learn progression. None of that would have been experienced had you not taken that first step to try to obey. So I love that, man. I think that's powerful. Good stuff, man.
There is a second thing that I wanted us to kind of go into. I had hinted at it a little while ago, but Pastor Key, in your message, you took us through this journey, right? And then eventually you got to the place of you kind of illuminated the thought that I think a lot of people have when we talk about obedience, and how one of the other reasons why we are not more obedient, or why we struggle with the idea of obedience, number one, is because, and especially in America, especially in the culture that we live, obedience sounds too restrictive.
Yeah.
Right? It sounds too much like a closed fist, when really what all of us want and what we're trying to go after is kind of like this open hand policy towards life. Oh, everything is fine. Everything is permissible so long as you can make sense of it and you could live. And so long as you're not hurting anyone, everything is fine, right?
No.
It's obedience is too restrictive. I wonder if we could speak to that idea, maybe kind of speak against that idea that Christian obedience is not actually restrictive, but it's the gateway, it's the door through which we walk into a more fulfilled and redeemed life. I'd love for us to speak into that a little bit more.
Yeah. Pastor Bobae, I've been going first this whole time. They got that eye roll, by the way.
They're always watching.
Now they are. I think... I think the way God's hand is different from the way we think. Meaning, or the way we've experienced what happens when we disobey. When we disobey our parents, we get punished for something. But when we disobey God, we miss out on something. I think that is the biggest difference. So we may think that it is restrictive, but it's only restrictive if you disobey. Meaning, like you said, obedience is the gateway to deeper, better, bigger things with God, more meaningful things, intimacy with God. And if we disobey, then you just stay the same. You just stay in the same place. And you might be okay being there, but somewhere along the way, you'll realize what you missed out on. And when you realize what you missed out on, there's no going back sometimes. You know, there is redemption, but like I mentioned last time, I do believe there is a certain type of grace for something that God is calling you to do in this moment. And you miss that when you disobey. So I think that is why people feel like it's so restrictive. Like that, you know, because they compare it to the ways that they've been punished or the consequences that they've received because of their disobedience more in the natural. But in God's realm, I think it's a little bit different. So, I mean, you know, all of this that I'm saying, like even the way I answered before and now, it's all like, because I'm learning it too. And I think I'm not afraid that God's going to punish me anymore. I think I was when I was in like high school, you know?
Yeah.
But as I've matured and as I've grown in my intimacy with the Lord, the thing I keep saying these days more often now is that I don't want to miss out. And to me, that is the consequence of disobedience. So yeah.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah, that was really good, actually. Thanks, Pastor Bobae. I think when it comes to obedience, especially in the Christian context, when people think about it, they think of, I think they're falling for the lie that Satan, well, I think they're falling for the lie that of Genesis, of early Genesis with Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's fascinating because I remember actually I was in missions in China and they were talking about the whole serpent, tempting and this and that. And basically their whole thought was God is a God who prohibits. Why is he the God who prohibits? Right? And then if you think about it, it's like, no, God is not the God who prohibits. He gave them free reign of the entire garden to do pretty much whatever they wanted, right? And it was just this one little boundary that he put into place. And I talked about this in a previous sermon, but he puts that boundary there because you need boundaries to flourish in life. And the illustration I like to use is actually grammar, but I'll use a different one. So I don't know. Sometimes I'll be on Instagram and I see these people who just use a pencil and they can make photorealistic images just using their pencil. I'm like, oh my God, that's unbelievable.
Yeah.
But you know how they got there? They got there because they subjected themselves to discipline, right? They subjected themselves to learning technique, to learning these basic things that were probably felt like straitjackets to them initially, right? But as they obeyed, if you will, those particular parameters and boundaries of this particular art, they were able to create things that they would not have been able to create otherwise. But let's say they had thrown all those, they're like, you know what, I don't want to learn these techniques. And they just kind of started drawing everywhere. They're enslaved to chaos at that point. They're enslaved to less expression, believe it or not. And so that's, for me, the best way to think about it. Like, God puts these boundaries in place because as you obey God through these ways, your expression of life becomes that much more healthy, that much more wide, that much more rich. And I hope people could really, for me, that's very persuasive. That's very compelling. You can use it for any discipline. Use it for music. Let's say, you just play any keys, right? I don't listen to rhythm or any of that stuff. Or, it's going to sound like garbage, right? But once I structure myself to, the parameters of music theory and things like that, I'm able to create some of the most beautiful music out there in the world. And that's basically the same thing with life. And if you understand God, especially God when you see Jesus on the cross, man, you think he's out there just to restrict you? No, man, he's really there to give you the fullness of life. And just one more way to think about it, I think for me it's interesting because human beings, we have finite minds. As big as our imaginations are, we have finite minds, right? But God has infinite imagination. And so if you submit yourself to the infinity that God is, what you can think of what your life should be pales in comparison to what it could be, under God. And so there's just so many ways of attacking it that it's hard when people tell me that God is restrictive. I'm like, man, you don't really know much about God or just life, actually. So, but anyway.
Yeah, it's always such an interesting thing when people say that, only because, and I come up against this more and more the older that I get, but it's like, okay, what is the other end of what they're describing?
Yeah.
Safety, like growing a career, earning a certain amount of money, especially in what's pervasive around this culture, right? Like, and in this region, it's getting as much money or power or influence as possible. It is setting yourself up to retire by a certain age. It is setting up your kids if you're building a family. It's taking care of your parents if you're in a position and have to do that. And I don't know, like that seems pretty restrictive to me.
Exactly,
like,
right.
submitting yourself to a lifetime of only thinking and like that being your paradigm.
Yeah.
That you will only be happy if you earn X amount of dollars, or you'll only be happy if you are, what's the old phrase? It's like, I'm only happy with more. Like, what's the amount of money that you need? More, right? Like, and it's, I don't know, like the older that I get and the more that I understand how this world works outside of the four walls of the church, there's a part of me that just goes, man, if anything, that's the restrictive life.
Yeah, that's right.
To me, in my eyes, the idea that I have to work this job for 40 years only to earn a pension that'll last me so that I can continue to have money until I finally go meet the Lord in heaven, that seems like the restrictive
that's right.
thing to me.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like the idea that I can learn new aspects of my spirituality and my relationship with the Lord simply by doing something as silly as no red meat for this season.
Yeah.
And I learned something about myself, and I learned something new about God, and I learned something new about what I can or cannot do. I don't know, like that just seems like the better thing.
Yeah. And it expanded you.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah, that's beautiful, man. And C.S. Lewis actually talks about this because he says those who throw off God and want to do it their own way, those are the people at the end of the day that fall into very predictable patterns, believe it or not, because they're so subject to their own desires.
Yeah.
And your desires are very, if you just follow your animalian desires, are very, very predictable.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
don't wait. I mean, simply put, don't wait. Don't wait to at least do something, right? Like, I don't think the three of us, I don't think we would ever, the first things out of our mouths would ever be like, sell all your possessions and go to this far off and distant land. I don't think I don't believe the three of us would ever say anything like that. I mean, so much of what we try to do as pastors is it makes sense. Okay, so there's this huge thing called obedience, and we're trying to make sense of it. Here's what you could do in your everyday life, right?
Yeah.
So, just don't wait, please. Like, I don't know. My heart goes out to those that continue to like whine and and I don't mean whine in like I don't mean to look down on and use that kind of a language, but there is something to that, right? There's just kind of like a desperate plea, like, oh, I want something more, but then you continue to submit yourself to the paradigm of this world, which is just keep working, keep earning, and get ahead in this rat race of life. And I don't know.
I think
I should be so lucky.
Yeah. I think one piece to this is sometimes desperation will get you to a place of obedience. I think I experienced that. I talked about it in my sermon. Like, desperation got me to a point of prayer.
Yeah.
But I will say, though, some people get to a place of desperation and they don't go to prayer. They don't go to those things. Yep. So it's still, as much as God will get you into a desperate place, you still need to make a conscious decision to obey, even at that point. But yeah, I don't know. Sometimes you need to be put in a hard place to to obey. But but you don't have to be there. You don't have to get there to do that. So,
Lord, let it happen sooner rather than later.
Amen.
I want to start to make our descent. We've been at cruising altitude for a little bit. I want to start to make our descent.
I love this imagery that you use.
Pastor Key, in our staff meeting, I'm going to go to you first, but Bobae, I'm coming your way. Don't you worry about it. But in our staff meeting yesterday, we're recording this on Wednesday. So in our staff meeting yesterday morning, you said something. It's funny. Every time you say this, I find it kind of funny. Because though I understand it as a pastor and as a preacher, I didn't get the sense.
Okay.
But you obviously felt it in a very deep way. So I kind of wanted to understand this part of it a little bit more. But yesterday in the staff meeting, you just basically said, like, afterwards you were so depressed. Like, having given this message, you were just so depressed because you felt like you didn't hit some of the notes that you wanted to hit. I totally understand that feeling, by the way. I actually, the last time I preached for our church, I felt the exact same. I was like, oh, shoot. I did almost nothing that I wanted to do in that message. No, but you had said that. I wanted to maybe lean into that, push that button a little bit. Help us understand what that means when you say that.
Yeah. when I was
after I know
I felt that so hard. That
yeah.
So when I was delivering the sermon, man, I felt distracted. None of my comedic timing was there. Not that I have any comedic timing, but every once in a while I'm inspired, right? And none of the dynamics that I wrote in the manuscript came out. And I felt, I think the words I used at the staff meeting was, I felt like that was the worst sermon I gave in years.
Yeah, it's so funny. You said that.
And I don't know. I had a particular vision of how that sermon was going to end up being. And I think I was probably comparing it to that. But the other thing is I don't know how people are receiving it. So that I think I need to be a little bit more open to that. My wife said, it wasn't your worst.
Leave it to Rala to speak the truth.
I like that. It wasn't your worst. I know which one your worst.
Yeah, I could tell you right now.
Or it wasn't as bad as you thought, or something like that, which wasn't very helpful. But yeah, I don't know. It's tough because just so people know the kind of struggle that pastors go through. So for me, preaching in seminary, I learned is primary to my calling as a pastor, right? And so I try to work really hard in taking that seriously and delivering messages that I feel like will teach them something real, will hopefully do it in a way that's somewhat entertaining and informative, easy to listen to and stuff. And also, it doesn't help that all the church planning data out there says when a person comes to your church, the sermon is really where it's at.
Sure.
You know what I mean? And I'm like, well, I get one chance at this. And so what depressed me was, believe it or not, I saw some newcomers there. And I'm like, okay, I lost them.
Oh, Lord.
That is a lie.
Dagger to my heart.
So that was one of the things I was thinking. I was just like, man, God, I really,
wow.
And also recently, so there's parts of my sermon that I didn't want to include that I included because I felt like this will speak a little bit more to non-believers or people who are exploring the faith a little bit. And so, but I'm just like, did that really work? I'm not sure, and this and that. And so I was just a lot of second guessing. And so that's the difficult thing, right? Pastors, we struggle with, hey, we got to work really hard. You need to put your time in to make a message, right? But then the other part is, well, God's grace, really relying on God's grace. And sometimes if you work too hard on a message, you're like, oh, am I depending too much on my strength? And therefore not depending on God's grace. And that's why it bombed. You know? So it's like there's this crazy mental, gymnastic thing that you're going through. And sometimes I'm just like, I don't know where I fell on that. But then the other thing is like you rely too much on God's grace and you become lazy and you don't put the work in, And so it's just like, God, this sucks.
Yeah. Yeah. Why do you call us to do this, Lord? It's damned if we do, damned if we don't.
Oh man. So it was just I don't know. But it was interesting because the first person I talked to after I gave the sermon, she goes, "That was a really good sermon." I was like, "You're a liar." No, that's literally what was going through my mind. You're just being nice.
That's how it really felt if you're listening. If you're that person, that's how he really felt, guys.
Yeah.
Oh man. So
he's not alone in feeling.
It's okay, Pastor Key. It's okay.
You better pray for us if you're watching. You better stretch out your hand and pray. The screen right now. Put your hand on the screen right now and pray for us. It's so funny, Pastor Key. This is not just to gas you up, but there's a commentary here that is at play. But Pastor Key, I really respect you. Not only for your style of preaching and your style of leadership and the fact that you've been so good to me personally, but Bobae, I'm sure you've been the recipient of this as well. But but also just like I have a lot of respect for people that have so many years in the ministry.
Yeah.
You know, like upwards of 20 ish.
It's like 25.
Yeah.
Look at you, 25 years.
Your ministry career is old enough to go rent the car. You know?
I don't know if that's encouraging, man.
No, what I meant. Okay, let me try to find it.
It's like fine wine. How about that?
Yes,
How about that,
wine.
Josh?
Fine wine. It only gets better with age. Yes. So what I mean to go is, it's funny how after all these years you still have a, what do I call, like a fear, like a holy fear, a righteous fear of the moment, right?
Yeah.
It's I don't know, like there are days, there are seasons in my life in which I preach and I have no fear, and it's not good. Like I don't mean that I'm fearless. I mean that I have no like reverence. I have no holy fear of that place and being the mouthpiece, like being the person through which somebody else is going to receive a truth of the Lord, right? Like there are some days where I don't have that fear, and I don't know, like the one thing that stands above all the other things here, Pastor Key, is that this idea. I think that only happens because you have a holy fear of that place. And I think it's good, right? I think it's like cold water down your back. It just makes you kind of be focused and try to do everything that you can. But then also the other side, maybe it goes past a certain place and then you start to feel like that was the worst sermon you gave in years. And I don't know, because like the other thing too, and this is the thing about this podcast, is like I want it to be proof positive that even if you felt that, Pastor Key, there is still good and fruitful conversation to be had out of a message like this, right? Yeah. And it's just to like, believe that unconditionally. It's absolutely possible, So anyway, it's funny that you said that, and I wanted to encourage you with that. And I know that's that feeling very well, but Bobae, for you, I'm sure there are times, there are moments, there are messages for you too, I'm sure, that you kind of feel that way. How do you wrestle with that moment? What do you do in that place? Like, how do you even get past that?
I hide. That's like immediately what I thought. Man, no, I think
the honesty on this podcast is through the roof right now.
Well, it is true.
Yeah.
Like there is a part of me that like really wants to hide when I feel like I've bombed it or it wasn't what I wanted it to be or thought it was gonna be. And then I listen to it again. Yeah. It's not self-torture. In the beginning, it used to feel very torturous. But then I listened to it, I'm like, oh, it's not half bad. It wasn't like that bad. Yeah. Because I think when we think something is bad, it's so extreme. Oh, that was like the worst, you know? But the reason why I listen again is so I can grow. But then when I do listen again, I'm like, oh, it isn't that bad. And then so that like helps me move on and then hope for the best the next time. But I do think like it really depends on the type of week or months I've had leading up to this message. Well, lucky for me, I don't preach every week like that. I preach to the children, but that's not nearly the same type of prep I have to do to preach in front of like adults, I go from like preaching 7-10 minutes to like 30. Yeah. Like, your girl is not good at that. But I think it really does depend, at least for me, on what kind of input I've had from the Lord. That makes all the difference. Yeah. Not just in my delivery, but the way I feel after. Because generally speaking, I want to say 100% of the time that I've preached, I don't think, oh yeah, I nailed it. It's always like, huh, you know? But then, and then people come up and say like, oh, that was so good, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, thank you. And then that makes me want to hide even more. Yeah. So it's all, so just, you just trust the Lord and hope that next time it doesn't suck as bad as this time. Yeah. No, absolutely. Again, to both of you, I feel like we're in lockstep. There are so many times and seasons where you have it,
or you don't have it.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, really.
some messages you got it, and I wish I could point to like the prep, but I've done messages. I've done the 30-hour prep, and I've done the 3-hour prep, and I've done the 10-hour prep, and I've done the 15. You know, I've done it, and there almost seems to be no formula.
No, not at all.
For whether or
Right.
not,
No.
you know, like if you just work on it more, it'll get
Yeah.
better.
No.
I don't know. I've
No
tried.
way.
I've
Yeah.
so tried. You know, I said this to my wife Dawn, kind of like toward the beginning of our relationship. I think I said, I forget how it came up, but basically the idea was there are times when it's like my flesh wants. I want to hear, that was a great sermon. Pastor Josh, what a great sermon. Wonderful. But the thing is, I recognize that that is my flesh, right?
Yeah.
And so my spirituality, the thing that maybe is a little bit closer to him, I would rather not hear anything. Not good, not bad. I don't want to hear anything. Just if it was a good message and if you were blessed by it, go away. And go do whatever go live out
right.
whatever the blessing, like that's my heart, right? But I know that sometimes people need to be able to say it just because it meant so much to them. I get that, right? And after X amount of years, I finally learned to kind of just receive it with some humility, but then also like receive it with the right amount of just, okay, Josh, just let the Lord continue to do the work and not you, right? So it's funny because like in the beginning she didn't quite get it or understand it. You know, she sort of like, okay, I think I get it, but not really. But I still kind of come back to that. You know, for me, if I had my way, my most like even keeled, I have found nirvana sort of a state. Don't say anything. If the message was good, first of all, if the message was bad, don't you dare say anything. Because I don't know that I can handle it. But if the message was good, just do me a favor. Go and live it out. Just go and do it. And let that be the thing. And that will be my reward. And that will be the sort of thing that I walk away with. So I don't know. I just think it's funny. Different years of experience, different contexts, different everything. But we still kind of have that thing. I think it's a good thing.
Yeah. I think what made this Sunday worse was the years of experience.
Yeah, it's
because in my mind,
so interesting.
I was driving home. So after I was smiling and shaking hands and having a good time talking to people during fellowship, and then I got into my car and I just started yelling at God. Not like at him, but saying like, God, I failed. I'm sorry. It's just like, and I just really was really, really upset. And part of what made it so much worse is I said to God, like, God, it's been 25 years. Why is this still a thing?
Yeah.
You know, and it felt like, I mean, to me, while I was up there, I'm like, this feels like a sermon I would have given maybe about 15 years ago. And so that's kind of what made it much worse. But really, I think, and thank you for your kind words before. Really, I actually, as you were sharing that to me, I was getting kind of emotional because, it's encouraging to hear. But really, I think what I long for is for people when they hear my preaching, and genuinely, I don't know if you've been listening to my prayers before I preach nowadays. I'm just like, God, just do something. And I want people to have an encounter. Like, I want people to have a moment like they just feel God, and because I've had those moments, I'm like walking around, hear something, or, and I'm like, oh my God, God bless me through this person. I'm just like, God, I want to be that. I want to be able to do that for people so that they really have an encounter with you. And I felt like I had just bombed at this past Sunday, and not like necessarily you can control that per se. You don't want to artificially, because you see so much on social media, people try to manufacture that, right? But I don't know. So, but yeah, this is a good discussion. I'm glad we talked about this. I think this is therapeutic for me.
Hansungi is okay. It's okay.
We can go on and on about sadness and how we fail and all this stuff.
Podcast therapy.
Yeah, this is good. This is good. You better have kept your hand on that screen if you're
seriously,
watching.
Pray for us.
We need to pray all throughout this segment. I continue to have an amazing time on these podcasts for no other reason than we get to dive into those kinds of places, right?
Yeah.
And if you're listening, if you're watching, I hope you understand that, like, we're all trying here, right? Like, none of us have it.
Yeah.
And we're not masters, but for whatever reason, we feel like God has called us to a certain place. Mm-hmm. And the three of us, and so many more pastors too. Like, I'm not just highlighting us three as like we're the only three pastors in this region that are trying to be faithful, right? Like, like pastors, I feel like good, honest Christian pastors that are just trying to live out the Word of God. We're just all trying to be faithful, and we struggle with obedience plenty of times too, right? Yep. And we struggle with whether or not we're good enough for the ministry that we've been called to. So hopefully that also is an encouragement, right? If you're listening or if you're watching, hopefully that's an encouragement to you, as it's been to us, that God is going to continue to use you, right? And you're going to fail. That's okay. But just pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and just continue to be obedient in all the ways that He's called you. So I think that's a good place. That's a good place to land. We went a little long, but I think it was all good.
Yeah.
I think it was all good.
And we can cut it up, put some clips in here and there, different places.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. If you're watching or listening, you should be kind of in tune or following us on IG, and you should be subscribed on YouTube, because like this is where these kinds of things go.
Yep.
My wife was asking me, like, so what's the point of all this? It's really just to leverage places like YouTube and Instagram, not so much to serve ourselves, but to serve others, right? Yeah. And so you should definitely be following us if you're not, because this is where you'll get tidbits and little morsels that'll help you throughout your week. And we even started to record our Sunday sermons, the message portions.
Yes.
And through the IG, we're kind of putting out little videos here and there.
One of our productions people said we should start doing that. They're like, everybody else is doing it. Not that we do it because everybody else is doing it, but sometimes a little snippet can be helpful. Yeah. In the week.
We could leverage this for good, right?
Yeah.
And the three of us will just try to be accountable to that idea, that it'll be leveraged for good and not for self-gain. So
wait, so there's like two things now looking at us when we preach?
Yeah.
No. Oh shoot.
Yeah. There's the live stream camera, and then there's a separate phone camera that we use, and that's the IG one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
you don't notice it.
For next time.
For next time. Yeah. Sooner rather than later. Also, last announcement, we have a guest speaker this coming Sunday, which means if everything has held true, that means that next time you listen to our voices and this podcast goes out, we're going to have the guest speaker join us.
Yes.
And we're
excited for that.
We're going to have a guest on this podcast, which I'm super excited about. The last one we had was the speaker for our annual retreat.
That's right. Yeah. Jason Coe.
And I had such a blast that time. I know that we're going to have such a blast next week as well. So be on the lookout for that podcast when it comes out. In any case, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for watching. Hopefully the video portion of it works out and we're able to put that up. This conversation, it's an ongoing one between the three of us and in the life of our church. So just know that there's more to come. With that, we're going to bring this to a close. Thank you so much for listening again. This is NMPC Plus signing off for now.